Well, tonight we come to our very last lecture, and we've really finished that pie chart in which we looked at all of the cultural institutions. What we want to do in this last lecture now is to take a look at what all of this means in respect to the changing globe in which we live. And so tonight's lecture is called World in Transition. And we're really going to be pulling together two chapters from your text, chapter 17 and chapter 19, in which we talk about what has actually transpired in the world as cultures have come increasingly into contact, as we have established what some folk are referring to as a global village. But more than that, one of the things that we want to do is look at a field that is generally referred to as applied anthropology. And that's one of the reasons why we're moving away from that cultural institutions chart that was that we've been using as our guide through the entire semester. We're going to be moving away from the theoretical study of anthropology to an inquiry into the applied nature of anthropology. And we're only going to briefly touch on the application of anthropological insights, but it is one of the important components of the whole study of anthropology. What can you do with an anthropology degree? Well, apart from teaching it and becoming kind of self-consuming, there are a number of things that anthropological insights can do in terms of development issues, in terms of trying to understand global issues, and we're going to look at a couple of those tonight, namely world hunger and overpopulation. So tonight, what we're going to do is focus on three particular issues. We'll be talking about the impact of the old world and the new world, and we'll use those terms because old world and new world, while they have certain kinds of connotations, do reflect some geographical realities, namely the European world that was the known world, that had been the known world all the way from the time of Christ up until 1492, to the New World, which is the North America, South America, and in many respects, all of Oceania, and even parts of Asia. We also want to look at some contemporary issues then, namely overpopulation and hunger, and we want to conclude with some Christian reflections on what it means to be a believer in our day and age. So with that, let's take a look at the first issue, the impact that the old world has had on the new world. What was the impact of Columbus' arrival on the new world in 1492? And we're going to look at some positive changes, we're going to look at some negative changes. Now, folk have made a career out of picking on good old Christopher Columbus and saying he really didn't discover the new world. It had been discovered long before then. And indeed, there is abundant evidence that there were other explorers who had made their way to the Americas. We know that that there are some possibilities for Vikings to have arrived in the New World and perhaps left some inscriptions. There's a possibility that Egyptian sailors had made their way here. There's a possibility that Chinese sailors had made their way to the New World, and that Polynesians may have made their way to the New World. So what was different about Columbus? Columbus's arrival was entirely different than the occasional contacts that had been made by previous explorers. Following Columbus' arrival, there was going to be sustained, constant contact between the two worlds. This would be more than a mercantile contact. This would be a total contact of cultures, not just of a ship and a few goods or a few people. This would be a contact that would change very, very dramatically all of the cultures involved, both the old world cultures and the new world cultures. So let's take a look at some of those. Let's look at the positive changes first. And we'll begin with the notation that one of the things that did happen, and I have put them here under positive, they initiated new trade routes and the movement of goods, including food and other items of value. So new trade routes were opened up. As a matter of fact, that was what the search for the New World was all about. It was an attempt to find a way to the East. Folk wanted the goods that were available from the East. That included spices, silks, other commodities that were available from China. Prior to 1492, all goods had to come through Islamic traders who acted as middlemen who hiked up the price. And the Europeans wanted direct access to those trading ports on their own. As a matter of fact, the Portuguese, if you study the Portuguese, and of course their effort to get around the Cape of Good Hope and up to India, and what did they discover when they got to India and to the Far East? They discovered that the trade routes were already pretty well being monopolized by Islamic traders. And so the first thing that the Portuguese had to do was build some fortified cities on the east side of Africa, and then they had to send some warships to blow the Muslim traders out of the water, literally. They engaged in a trade war, and they defeated all of the Islamic navies and sank their ships, and then said, now, we're top dog in the region, we'll be the ones that move the goods. And so it was virtually a trade war to control access to spices and silks and whatever else. Now, other folk were saying, there's got to be a better way. See, instead of having to go down there and fight not only the Islamic traders, but also those Portuguese. And so they commissioned Christopher Columbus. He went looking for the New World via a route to the west, and he was hugely disappointed. Instead of finding a route to India, he found a route to a new land. But that opened up the whole possibility then of what could they do with the New World. And they did. New trade routes were now established, and new possibilities for moving goods were opened up in a very dramatic fashion. In addition to these new trade routes that allowed now for goods to move from the Americas to the Old World or to Asia, there were a possibility for new allies being formed. European powers began to ally themselves with some of the emperors, kings, other leaders in the developing world, and they lent their support behind them against their traditional enemies. And so allies were formed, and kingdoms were often made through an alliance with the Europeans who were making their way into these regions of the world. Now, there was the negative side of that. Some of them were also destroyed. And your textbook does a marvelous job of pointing out a number of the African kingdoms that fell as a result of contact with the Western world. The Songhai Empire, for instance, fell. That would have been, Songhai had its headquarters in Timbuktu. In case you've never realized that Timbuktu was a real place, it was the head of a very, very powerful North African kingdom. And there were other kingdoms all through Africa that were very, very sophisticated, including the Kingdom of Congo. And it became a major ally of the Europeans as they were making their way down the coast of Africa. And of course, there was the Inca and Aztec kingdoms here in the New World. Many of these, by the way, were far larger and even more sophisticated than the European countries in their period of development at this time in history. Well, people started to ally with these and to help them in their own kingdom building. There were some negative impacts, and the negative impacts were probably more than the positive ones. When the Europeans arrived, they declared sovereignty over the countries that they claimed. As a result, they defeated the petty kingdoms that they found in some of these countries, and some of them not so petty countries. They defeated a number of kingdoms in Africa. They defeated the Aztec and Inca in America. They took over the sultanates of India and Southeast Asia. They destroyed the kingdoms of the islands in Oceania. And one of those, of course, included the Hawaiian kings. They were, Hawaii was a very delightful place. It was under the rulership of Hawaiian royalty. Traders there decided that they weren't getting the kind of deal that they wanted, and so they talked the American representative there to deploy some troops, and quite contrary to American law, American Constitution, and the sovereign rights of the Hawaiian nation, they dethroned the king or queen and declared Hawaii a territory of the United States. And by the time they got around to challenging it legally, it was already fully incorporated into the United States as a trust territory, ultimately to become a state. There are a lot of Hawaiians who are still bitter about that. And I don't think that we've heard the end of that story, but I'm not sure quite how they will work out the details. But whatever the case may be, we went around the globe destroying anybody who stood in opposition to the desires of the old world to sustain or declare sovereignty over the rest of the world. And this included even the destruction of such powerful kingdoms as what is found in Japan and in China. And if any of you are movie buffs and you've seen the film The Sand Pebbles, the story of how we engaged in gunboat diplomacy all through Asia, and how we would send gunboats up and down their rivers, and we would force peace upon them. And the whole Opium War was a forced war in which we required China to open up its ports to trade with the Western world, because we wanted what China had and China didn't want what we had. And the only thing that we had that they could possibly use was opium. Well, they wanted our gold, and we didn't want to give our gold up. At first, for the first period of trade, we traded our gold, and then realized all of our gold's going to them, and we're taking all of their tea and silk and spices, but we're eating them up, wearing them out, and then we got to give more gold back, and they're keeping all the gold. And so somehow or another we wanted to right that imbalance, so we forced them to take opium, which we could grow in other countries, forced opium on them, and then could buy the spices and things that we wanted. Well, it was a very uneven and or immoral treaty. And interestingly enough, I don't hear of an awful lot of Christians complaining about the opium wars or the forcing of opium trade on China. And it's remarkable that God didn't judge us much more severely than he already has over what we did to the Chinese during that time. But I think it's become turnabout fair play here, because now we're the nation of junkies, and what we tried to do to them, they have successfully returned back to us, probably several-fold. Well, let's not moralize about it. The point of fact, rulers were put down and sovereignty was lost. There was also a major problem with population decline. Whenever Europeans showed up, they inevitably brought with them European-style diseases, and those European-style diseases were absolutely the end of literally hundreds of thousands of people, because they had absolutely no immune system to them. One of the very deadly diseases that we brought with us as we went around the globe was smallpox, which we had developed a immunity toward. It wasn't deadly, it was serious, but it was something that we could survive. We also had cholera, and we had learned to deal with some of these things. But as we went around the world taking our diseases with us, whole populations would die out as a result of contact with the diseases that we would introduce. And you see this, for instance, in the movie Hawaii. If you have read the book or seen the movie, the poxes, that family of diseases, hits the Hawaiian Islanders, and they don't know how to handle it, and they go down and they try to cool their feverish bodies in the ocean, and all they do is expose themselves then to chills that then further deteriorate their systems. And folk literally died by the thousands. And the population of the New World, which was fairly stable and had been for quite a long while, took a very, very sharp decline, and folk died off in tremendous numbers. Whole villages wiped out, and sometimes tribes going into total extinction. Well, there was also cultural repression. A depressing list of things here, but we do need to talk about them. Cultural repression. The New World insisted that the New World, the people who were being subjugated to the Old World political systems, would also be forced to subject to the Old World cultural patterns. And so everything that was cultural was looked down upon as being heathenish, as being uncivilized, as being barbaric. And so here were these Englishmen running around in the tropics with woolen clothes on, and convinced that this was the epitome of civilization. And over the weekend, I watched a movie that was of particular interest to me, because it was the story of the missionization of the Huron tribe in Canada. And so the movie is Black Robe, and it's the story of the French Jesuits and their first attempt to bring the gospel to the Huron tribe. And the mission, the site of the mission, was just a few miles from where I was born. And so I knew about the Huron mission, and took a fancy in it, so I thought I'd like to see the movie. And indeed, here you see this French Jesuit priest with his big black hat and his long black robe, making his way up through the wilderness to bring the gospel to the Huron tribe. And they have nothing, absolutely nothing but disdain for Indian culture. And the point of the whole movie is the fact that while there were some very, very barbaric kinds of things, there were some very beautiful things about Indian culture that this French Jesuit priest is beginning to understand and to appreciate. And it sends him into a bit of a crisis of faith, actually, because he's convinced that French Catholics, see, have the total truth. Boy, where have we heard that one before? And bless him, he gets up there and discovers that maybe he's got to open up a bit. And you know what? This is what contact with cultures do for you. And the Jesuits were some of the finest missionaries in the world. They were also some of the most difficult in the world. And so we can look to the Jesuits actually for some of the finest examples of mission work, and we can look at them and say, oh my goodness, let's not imitate that. And so we have to accept both the good and the bad there. But here comes cultural repression. There's also the whole issue of economic subjugation. The peoples of the New World were forced to become then slave laborers, if you would, or at least near slave laborers for the old world kingdoms. And this was not a pleasant story. And if you read anything about the story of the missions moving up here through Southern California, for instance, they really did subject the Native Americans here to slave labor conditions, all in the conviction that this was part of civilizing them and Christianizing them. Well, as they subjected them to these horrible brutalities, there was some massive rejection of Christianity and hostility toward the powers that be, and it was cultural imperialism at its very worst. Still more significant, and perhaps the most significant, is that in the contact between the old world and the new world, the old world began to move massive amounts of its population into the new world. The immense amount of land that was available here was simply too much of a temptation. Here was land, vast expanse of it, with resources that seemed to be unending, just available for the taking, and folk began to move here by the thousands and then by the hundreds of thousands. And when they couldn't move them fast enough, sometimes they even began to bring them here as slaves, so that the whole institution of slavery was given a fresh impetus with the discovery of the New World. Slavery had been around for hundreds of years. They go all the way back to the days of Joseph, if you would. But slavery had never been so racially and so ethnically focused as it came to be during this particular period of the history of the human race. Up until the 1500s, virtually every people had enslaved virtually every other people. So Vikings were enslaving folk from England, and they would send their Viking ships down and would capture Frenchmen, they would capture Englishmen, they would capture Spanish, they would capture anybody that they wanted, take them back to Norway or Denmark or wherever, and make them their slaves. Africans would enslave other Africans. Native Americans would enslave other Native Americans. It's been a pattern that has gone throughout all of history. But with the discovery of the New World and something very interesting happening in the New World, the tremendous population decline as a result of the introduction of diseases. Here was this potential for development in the New World, and nobody to do it. There were no laborers. And so before the Puritans ever arrived in this country to start the great experiment, see, with the Puritan colonies, slaves had already arrived. See, a Dutch ship had already arrived, bringing the first load of slaves from Africa, and people snapped them up right away. Oh my goodness, yes, slaves. Somebody to do all of the work that needs to be done around here, and there just was more work than there were people to carry it out. And as soon as the Dutch discovered that there was a trade for slaves, they immediately beat it back to Africa, loaded up with more slaves, and the slave trade then began to take off in a very, very dramatic kind of a fashion. And literally millions and millions of people were transported from Africa to the New World to engage in labor and plantation development in this country. The Slavery had been practiced. Muslims had been going down and capturing Africans for years. Other Africans had been capturing Africans for years. And so this was nothing new. But what did transpire that was new was the intensification of this. All of a sudden now, the slave ships were beginning to give guns to people that would support them in the slave trade, and now they could use guns to enslave other tribes to bring in more slaves. And so the intensity of conflict on the African continent increased very, very dramatically. And the practice of slavery or slave taking spread all through the Pacific and was known in the Pacific as blackbirding. And ships would pull in and pretend to be trading, and they would get people on board their ships and then tie them up and run them off to other islands as slave laborers. And it was a rather unpleasant period in the history of the human race. But what it did do was it moved massive amounts of people around. See, it moved Africans into the New World. It moved Indians into Oceania. It moved the Chinese into the New World, and you're getting these massive displacements of people, so that there is no longer the nice, tightly knit racial boundaries that once existed. You're beginning to get this massive influx of people from all around the world. Well, with this tremendous change taking place as a result of the impact of the old on the new, let's take a different look now. And let's look at the impact of the New World on the Old World. All right, we're going to switch here a little bit and look at how the New World changed the Old World. We've talked about how the Old World changed the New, but there are some different things that are going to happen here. There are going to be some positive changes, and I've listed them there all at once rather than giving them to you piecemeal, so that you can follow through where I'm going. But one of the first things that we want to note is that the New World gave to the Old World a lot of new foods. The New World was a literal, now I can't say literal bread basket, because a little bread basket would be a basket with bread in it, but it would be the bread basket of the world. We had foods here that the Old World did not know anything about that would become major staple food commodities in the rest of the world. Some of the New World foods, for instance, include potatoes, both white potatoes and sweet potatoes, corn, tobacco. I know we got a bad thing about tobacco these days, but tobacco. There was, in addition to these, there were certain kinds of spices, peppers, certain kinds of legumes, beans and things. There was cocoa and coffee. Food substances that the rest of the world would come to rely upon and build entire societies around. For instance, the sweet potato was introduced into the South Pacific by travelers going around the globe. We don't know who it was exactly, perhaps Magellan. When he left South America, he or someone like him would have taken a load of sweet potatoes, dropped them off in Indonesia. They in turn planted them, began to trade them around the Indian Ocean. They made it possible for people in the New Guinea highlands to move to higher levels of the highland valleys than had ever been possible before, because prior to that time, the primary food source for them was a taro plant that could hardly grow above about 3,000 or 4,000 feet. Sweet potatoes do beautifully all the way up to about 10,000, 12,000 feet. See? Well, that opened up a whole series of new areas in which people could move into, where they could plant gardens and they could make a living. So food was made available. Food that would dramatically change European cultures, including Ireland, that became very, very dependent upon white potatoes. Because when the potato famine hit Ireland, it was a major, devastating blow. As a matter of fact, do you remember the story of the mutiny on the Bounty? What was the Bounty doing? What was the Bounty commissioned to do? It went to the South Pacific to pick up what kind of a load? Remember that story? There's so many wonderful things out there for you yet to learn. Eh? They went there for the purpose of bringing back a load of breadfruit. They were going to try to see if breadfruit could grow in Europe. And if they could grow breadfruit in Europe, how marvelous. Here's a tree with all of these huge big fruits that you can cut down and roast, and you could have this marvelous fruit product, and you wouldn't even have to work at it. See, it would just grow naturally. Food growing from trees. It's not really like bread, by the way. It's more like a nut. But this was a scientific journey, see, to bring back breadfruit. And that was what led to the problems, because on the way back, see, they need all this water to feed the breadfruit, or to keep the breadfruit from dehydrating, and there's not enough water on board ship. And so you want to drink, got to go all the way up to the top of the mast, bring down the scooper. You can have one scoop, go all the way back up, put the hook back up there, And everybody gets all upset. They mutiny. First thing they do, throw the breadfruit overboard. I mean, it's integral to the whole story. But it was an attempt to experiment with food. Food from the South Pacific, food from the New World for the Old World. So that was one of the really neat things that the New World brought to the Old World. It provided them, the Old World, with access to new resources and wealth. There was gold and silver and tin and other natural resources that were available here. Trees, timber. The timber that was available in this country was remarkable. And the ability to come in and do timber harvesting. This was what drew my ancestors here to the New World, was the timber industry, because there was a tremendous demand for the timber that was available in the forest. Not just the timber, also the animal skins that were available here. And the hunt for furs was one of the things that developed some of the earliest economies, the old trappers moving up and down the Great Lakes system, trying to get those furs that they could take back to Europe, that could clothe people's bodies against the cold winters of the European continent. So the vast resources that were available here. Perhaps even more significant, though, than these exchanges of goods was the fact that the New World gave a new hope for the oppressed peoples of the Old World. We can't help but be aware that the Puritans came to be freed from religious oppression. And the opportunity to be able to start a new way of life, a new sense of hope, to begin a new life free from the oppression of the old life, the ability to break away from your economic bondage and to be able to start all over again. My people, the Hayward clan. I mean, what were we in Europe? We were peasants on a system that was rapidly falling apart, and the British royalty, they weren't quite sure what to do with us peasants. They really didn't need us any longer. And so they started the enclosure movement, where they started fencing off their lands and started saying, look, these common lands, we don't want you farming them anymore. It's cheaper for us to raise sheep than to let you farm it. And they started driving us off the lands. Where do you go? Well, the only way of life that you know, see, is farming on another man's land, and he's kicked you off of that land. See? And so folk flooded into the cities. See? And the cities were horrible, abysmal places. Well, the one hope that was available, see, for these displaced peasants and farmers was the New World. And they flocked here by the hundreds of thousands. And my ancestors did, as probably did many of yours. And they came here for religious freedom. They came here for economic potential. And they found here a marvelous opportunity for anybody that was willing to work hard. And so the whole American story goes. Well, it also inspired a great deal of aspiration in terms of freedom and democracy. And so freedom and democracy became one of the major positive changes as they watched democracy at work in the Native American tribes. As they saw the freedom that was being granted to these people who had so much access to resources. And the limited access to resources had created a very stultifying political system. All of a sudden now, access to unlimited resources and the watching of a people governing themselves through democratic processes began to stimulate a whole new concept of what life could be like. And I don't know that we'll ever know the extent to which the American Constitution was the product of Americans observing the lifestyle and the political systems of Native Americans. But there is definitely some kind of contact and some kind of inspiration taking place here. Well, are there any negative changes? I'll have to admit, I struggled long and hard to try to figure out if there were anything of a negative nature that the New World did to the Old World as a result of the contact. And you know what? I can only come up with one. And you see that on the slide. Access to hallucinogenics, namely tobacco and cocaine and some of the other hallucinogenics that are around, which were not a problem, by the way, to Native Americans. None of these hallucinogenic drugs were problems to Native Americans because their hallucinogenic effects were restricted to ritual purposes. They smoked the peace pipe, so they smoked the tobacco in ritual conditions. They took the cocaine in ritual conditions. They took their hallucinogenic drugs only when they were going to use them to contact the spirit world. And so, as a matter of fact, in Mexico, they had a drink called pulque. I won't ask if anybody has ever tried it or even knows what it is, because you're not supposed to know. But it is a very strong alcoholic drink made from cactus. And the Aztecs used to drink pulque. And they would drink it till they got drunk and couldn't stand anymore. So they would, till boom, somebody caves over. But this was all part of a ritual ceremony. Anybody who got drunk on pulque, except during a sacred ritual, was killed. No alcoholics in that culture, I'll tell you, because they killed them all. The death penalty for drunkenness in an inappropriate time was death. So they had these very, very strict controls on the use of hallucinogenic drugs. Those drugs were discovered by the New World, and boom, we began to use them then in non-ritualistic fashion. As a matter of fact, we use them in what we would call secular fashion. We use them for recreational purposes, you know. Smoke a little weed, get a little high, feel really good, mellow out, you know. And so with no limits now on it, all of a sudden then this became something that was quite destructive for health and well-being. And frankly, that's the only negative that I can come up with. Now, that probably shows my bias. Are there other things, other negative impacts from the New World onto the Old World? Well, I would challenge you to try to come up with your own, see, as you study, as you think about cultures. See, what other negative impacts could you find that were transferred from the New World to the Old World following contact? But in the meantime, it's an interesting experience for us to think about. Well, we've talked about this matter of contact and collision, and we need to move on now to the fact that when that contact was made, apart from the immediate effects of the contact, a new globalization began to take place. For the first time now, we know the limits of our geography. We now no longer have incomplete maps. Well, I say we no longer have incomplete maps. I can still give you the latest version of the map of Irian Jaya that shows huge white spots all over it. Terrain uncertain. Some of those I've got mission stations in the middle of those white spots. So there are still unmarked, unmapped parts of the globe, but we still know the basic geographical nature of the world. And we know where the highest mountains are and all this sort of stuff. But this new globalization is the result of these massive discoveries that were taking place. And as a part of it, there was a rush for colonies. And the nations of the world tried to claim virtually every geographical portion of the world that they could possibly claim. And Africa was divided up, and the islands were divided up, and the New World was divided up. Portugal took part, Spain took part, along came the British and the Dutch and the French. Everybody tried to grab a part, and they often fought with one another over it. Then came the horrendous crash of this all. We were all getting very greedy for the rest of the world. And this was a whole part of colonialization. We all thought that we owned a piece of the world. And the United States wasn't any different, frankly. We got into it late because we were so busy trying to colonize just North America. And by the time we finally got America from sea to shining sea, the rest of the world had already been claimed. And so the only way that we could get a part of it was to declare war on an existing nation, which we did. So we declared war on Spain, we went down and we took Cuba, and we also sailed into the Philippines and we took the Philippines, which we're celebrating, by the way. We just celebrated a few days ago the takeover, the driving out of the Spanish from Manila and the American arrival. Not a real happy celebration, frankly, but we were out there ready to take over the rest of the world as well. Well, then came World War I, see? And in World War I, we defeated Germany. And what was the first thing that we did after we defeated Germany? We stripped them of all of their colonial possessions, see? So German East Africa, see, all of a sudden became British East Africa, now known as Kenya. And German New Guinea became a British territory. See, we started to strip Germany of all of its territories. Well, they weren't super happy about losing all of that, so they began to rebuild for the purpose of taking back their colonies. But they decided the only way they could take back their colonies was to also take over the rest of the nations that were trying to keep them from having colonies. And so they decided they were going to take over all of Europe. They were going to become the master rulers of the world. Well, with one exception. They decided that they would let Japan have the greater Asian prosperity system. And Japan could have their share of colonies all through Asia. So Japan was going to be allowed to take over China, Southeast Asia, all the way down to Australia, and take over the Far East. And Germany would take over the West, and, well, you know the story. World War II broke out. It was the last hurrah, if you would, of the colonial mentality. With the end of World War II, it was very evident that colonialism was a spent system. that we could not continue to exist this way. And between World War I and World War II, there had been building an idea of nationalism, of the rights of people to govern themselves. The League of Nations had been proposed, fell horribly on its face. As a consequence, following World War II, we started a new organization, the United Nations, and freedom was granted to all of these nations that had been former colonies. And the world as we know it today was formed as a consequence of the end of colonialization. Well, I don't think we've heard the last of that, because one of the interesting things that's coming out of all of that now is all those old colonial powers divided countries around not ethnic people groups, see, but around geographical territories that suited the European powers. And one of the things that we're discovering now is that sometimes people are not happy with whom they've been paired up with, see. And so the Tutsis are not at all happy, see, with having to share their land with another people group that are not them at all. And so I'm not sure that we have heard the end of all of this. As a matter of fact, the ethnic strife that we're currently seeing dividing Europe and Africa and other parts of the world may be one more attempt to reconstruct territories in accordance with some kind of ethnic or at least tribal understanding of who we are. And we may be in for a new reconfiguration that I have called Community of Nations. And how that will be formed, I don't know that any of us knows at this point. But whatever that configuration may look like, one thing is very evident, and that is that we will never ever be able to go back to isolation again. We are mutually dependent upon one another. And so somehow or another, we've got to come up with a means whereby folk can embrace their national identities and embrace their involvement with the community of nations, and somehow or another we can live without major destructive tendencies that turn us against one another. Well, this is all a process. It's taken several hundreds of years to get this far, and I'm not sure that we're through the end of it. And what the end of the story finally will turn out to be, I suspect, well, I know, only God knows. And if he gives us more time, we may be very, very surprised to see what the world looks like, say 50 or 100 years from now, if the Lord gives us that much time. One thing is certain. We will be moving more and more toward a one government system, because somehow or another the diversity that we have been experiencing in the past has not worked real super good. So it will be interesting to see. Well, contact and collision, globalization, these are some of the issues that anthropologists currently are very much involved in, and the study of the interaction and the study of culture change. Out of all of this has emerged something that is of immense concern to people in all disciplines, but anthropologists in particular are concerned about the whole issue of overpopulation and world hunger, as these have become part of the globalization scene. And I'd like to talk about, actually there's a whole lot of other problems I'd like to talk about. There's about 5 or 6 that I'd like to talk about, but we'll have to address those in subsequent classes and courses around the place. Let's just stick with overpopulation and world hunger. When it comes to overpopulation, I've tried to chart here in a rather scrawly hand, the chart that is in your text, so it's nothing new here, but this chart that shows what happens when you go from the time of Christ up to about the year 2000, and you move through these 2,000 years of human history, and what you have is a fairly stable population right up until about the, well, somewhere after 1500, 1492, there is this massive expansion of the populations around the globe, and all of a sudden things start to climb, and in the last few years, the last few decades, the last couple of hundred years at the very most, there has been this tremendous surge of population that has shot it up from below 1 billion people in the world to now where it is over 5 billion and reaching for the 6 billion mark, which you see there on the right. It has become a major issue and one that must be dealt with. Now, there is talk that this might stabilize out if we continue to press for population controls and everything. But what about this issue of overpopulation? What are the causes of overpopulation? And I remind you that your text talks about some of these solutions, and I don't intend to go into the details that are in your text. You can read those as easily as anyone. But they talk about, well, is overpopulation the result of better nutrition? Well, better nutrition is indeed a significant factor in the improvement in health and things. As a matter of fact, every generation of well-nourished people seem to grow in stature. That means you're growing taller, so that each generation since about the Middle Ages has crept up a few inches, so that somebody that today could be 6 feet tall and be quite normal. But quite frankly, if you were 6 feet tall in King Arthur's court, you would look like an oddity, because most of the folk in King Arthur's court were closer to 5'6", 5'8". As a matter of fact, if you go through the castles of Europe and look at all those suits of armor, most of us won't be able to fit into them. I mean, these guys are little shrimps. Well, you know, I shouldn't call somebody 5'6" a shrimp, but by comparison, you know, they're little people. Good nutrition has changed us biologically, and so all of a sudden now we're getting taller. And interestingly enough, we're also getting broader. See? The average width of a seat has increased several inches because we're getting broader in the hips. I mean, we're healthier people today. And now good food has done that. And that's great. But that's really not the reason why we're having an overpopulation problem. Because the better nutrition that is creating stronger, healthier bodies is taking place where, in populations where there is not a tremendous surge of population statistics. So while that's a good thing, it's not the chief cause of overpopulation. Rather, the reason seems to be that it is the access to better public health and a decline in infant mortality. It is not at all unusual in countries and in cultures where there is little or no medical facility available that half of the children will die before the age of 5. And the average lifespan of people in such cultures will be rounded out to about the age of 50. See? So changing public health, making public health facilities available, being able to deal with clean water, the killing off of insects and bugs and diseases, and the mass immunizations that have been taking place. They are saying now that it looks like polio will be all but eradicated within the next few years. See? And some of the other highly infectious diseases, see, gone. We don't have to worry about them anymore. I mean, we still have to be vigilant, but they're disappearing. See, the scourge of previous generations, see, is gone. Tuberculosis. See, who worries about tuberculosis much anymore? See, but tuberculosis was a terror, absolute terror, and to come down with tuberculosis was a death sentence. And not only a death sentence for the individual that came down with tuberculosis, but the whole family would be put under a major cloud of social rejection. Again, you know, these funky movies that I like to go around and watch because they have so many things to say that are the equivalent of American mythology. Picture Bride. See. Marvelous story about a picture bride who comes from Japan to work in the sugar cane fields of Hawaii. And the reason that this woman can't get married in Japan is because her family's had a history of TB. See, and she's kind of a frail, small-built woman, and she looks like a typical candidate for tuberculosis, and nobody wants to have her. So her family takes a picture of her and puts it in one of these picture albums, and they send it off to Hawaii. You know, would you like to marry? And people can go through and pick out the picture of the bride they want. And this fellow, oh yes, that's the girl of my dreams. And so he sent his picture back, and the match is made. Only when she arrives, the picture that he sent was like 20 years ago. And so he's really an old, homely kind of guy. And she says, oh, you're old, I don't want you. And he says, you're so frail, I didn't think you were so frail. You know, because she had all of the stuff that made her look nice and full. And so both of them are kind of disappointed, but they're stuck with each other because she now has to pay for her ticket. And so she decides to work, and well, it develops into a marvelous little love story. And, you know, you want a cheap date? See, go rent Picture Bride. See, you'll love it. Well, better public health. The better medical care. See, people are living longer. See, the average. See, they're predicting now that I'm going to live to the age of 87. See, now that's a whole lot different than the age of 50. See, 50 versus 87. 50 if there's no medical care. See? 87 if I take good care of myself, listen to my doctors, and keep getting an annual checkup. See, hey, well, you know, that's pretty neat. See? 37 years longer to live than I would have gotten on the average without medical care. Well, you know what that's doing? That means there's a lot of us old turkeys hanging around now a whole lot longer. So instead of dying off, we're sticking around for 30, 40 more years. Furthermore, all those kids that used to die, they're not dying anymore. They're growing up. And it's this improved health and longer lives that all of a sudden the birth and death rate is changing very, very dramatically, and the population is shooting off of the charts. Well, if that's the cause of overpopulation, what are the consequences? Well, the consequences, quite frankly, are that it becomes very, very ecologically demanding. We've got to have more firewood to heat homes for people. We have to have more supplies to build their homes. We have to have more food to feed them. We have to have more resources to support them. So it becomes a major drain on the ecology and upon the resources of the universe. Urbanization and migration. People are moving more and more into the cities or away from areas that can no longer support them. So people are moving off of the farms. They're moving into the cities. So we're getting this crowding effect, and you're getting cities, and then mega cities, and then who knows what's going to be next. Look at Southern California, the way Southern California has grown. I mean, just a tremendous expansion. What were once orange groves, see, are now urban cities, and some of those orange groves have become actually urban blights, and they're redeveloping these. And I'm living in one of those areas where they were orange groves when I was a youngster, and those orange groves were plowed under, and homes were built on lots, and those homes have now deteriorated to the point that they have to do urban renewal now in the city of Anaheim. And so what are they doing? They're tearing down all of those single residence homes and putting up condominiums. See? So that where there used to be maybe 25 homes, there are now 150 homes. See? Here we are all living in our little cracker boxes. See? And we're multiplying our demand upon the available resources of our community. Well, this puts additional strain on the available resources, and the result is poverty. You are getting a disparity between the wealthy and the poor. And so overpopulation is resulting in massive amounts of poverty and the rapid spread of shanty towns and folk who are living off of the economic edges of the rest of society. Well, how do we want to respond to these issues? They're fairly self-evident. Your text wants to bring into focus two different perspectives. If we're going to really understand population issues, we really have to look at why people have children, either many children or not so many, whether they choose to have 2 children or whether they choose to have 8 children. And if we begin to look at people's motivation for having children, perhaps this will help us to understand how overpopulation is a national, global issue. And so we look at children in American culture. Why do we have children in our culture? And the answer that we come back with is, well, we have children because we want to have children. We have children because it will bring personal enrichment. It will bring personal fulfillment, because it will make us feel satisfied with life. And, well, how many children does it take to feel satisfied? Well, depends on your lifestyle. We've got my wife has a brother and a sister-in-law, and they decided they weren't going to have children for a variety of reasons. So they've had virtually no children. That was their choice. And they're as happy as they can be. They're enjoying serving their church and taking mission trips and having all kinds of exciting things that are part of a lifestyle unencumbered by children. We, on the other hand, had 3. See? And when we get done with the 3rd one, we said, you know what, we think that's quite enough. See? 3 children, that's enough for us. Matter of fact, we're going to stop at 2, but, well, at least we were going to slow down at 2, but God had some other plans, and so we ended up with 3 children. But we kind of came to the conclusion that was enough. Why? Well, because 3, it costs a lot of money to have kids. See? You got to send them to college, and you got to raise them. You got to put clothes on their back. You got to buy them Mercedes-Benzes when they graduate from college. And, well, maybe not Mercedes-Benzes, but you know, you got to support them, and it's economically very, very costly. So we kind of cut it off at 3. By contrast, some people think 8 is quite enough. See? And I've talked with Indonesian farmers, and they, oh, yes. How many children were in your family? So I tell them, well, I grew up in a family of all boys. Oh, isn't that marvelous? How many? My mother had 7 boys. Oh, my goodness, I'm a national hero. Can you imagine a woman having 7 boys? Oh, that's great. You know, that's a perfect family. See? 7 boys. How many children do you have? 3. Couldn't have any more? No. And a little light comes on. Oh, yes, birth control, huh? See, because that was being taught around Indonesia while we were there. They loved large families. They weren't sure they wanted to do this birth control stuff. Now, we have children because we want to do something. We want to pour ourselves into a new generation. It brings us personal fulfillment, personal satisfaction. But is that the same motivation that people have in what your text calls lesser developed countries? And the answer is no. Children are seen quite differently in LDCs, to use the term of the text. Children are seen as potentially increased economic contributors to the well-being of the family. Boys are new forms of labor. Girls are capable of bringing in more bride wealth or bringing in more resources or contributing more to the economic well-being of the family. So children are an economic resource. So the more children you have, the more solid and stable is your economic base as a family. So they want to have lots of kids. And the only times when they have willingly agreed to smaller families is when they have been convinced that smaller families are economically more viable than larger families. So, the attitude toward children has to change very dramatically. And sometimes the only way to do that has been to come in and bring forced government policy. And indeed, this has been practiced all through India and China. I don't know that it's been forced in Indonesia, but other countries have forced sterilization or family control on some peoples. Well, enough on overpopulation. Let's talk about world hunger. Let's talk about world hunger. Another depressing topic. Let's look at the causes of world hunger. But let's not call it world hunger. Let's talk about chronic hunger. Because chronic hunger is different than the sporadic kinds of hunger. Things can happen as a result of war or of crises, and we've heard enough of these. But we're talking here about chronic hunger. If we talk about causes of chronic hunger, there are at least two solutions that we can give. Namely, we can talk about it as a problem brought on by a scarcity of food, or we can talk about it as inequality of food production or distribution. And this will raise all kinds of debate in academic circles. If it's a scarcity of food, what we need to do is plant more food. What we need to do is improve the quality of the food that's being planted. And so what we need here is a green revolution. What we need here is increased productivity. And so we make people work harder and smarter and get more food out there. See? Now, there are those who say, no, it's not a matter of trying to produce more food. There would be enough food if food was more equally distributed. And it's the unequal distribution of food that is the problem. Now, I have some very, very depressing kinds of figures that kinds of support this information. For instance, while people are starving to death in Africa, the majority of the peanut crop, and peanut is a good source of nutrition, particularly protein, the majority of the peanut crop from Africa is shipped off to Europe, there to be ground up into peanut oil to be used for cooking for French cuisine. See, here are people starving to death and yet shipping the very product that could save their lives off to Europe to feed Europeans. Crops in Latin America that could, or land that could be used to grow crops that would feed the hungry of Latin America, has been taken out of food production and has been planted in coffee so that you can have a morning cup of Java. See? So Juan Valdez, see, going out every morning to pick your beans, see, so that you can have the finest quality Colombian coffee, is really a starving peasant whose kids are home crying because they didn't have enough food, so that he can pick coffee so that you can have your cappuccino in the morning. And, you know, I'm not, that's not made up. I mean, this is actually happening. Massive amounts of productive land has been turned into cash cropping in the very areas where people are starving to death. And indeed, during the 1960s and 70s, when they were trying to do the green revolution, agricultural revolution all through Latin America, they discovered that if they would send down a lot of tractors and fertilizers and things and started turning some of these lands that had been taken away from the rich, evil hacienda owners and turned into public lands, that instead of growing corn and beans for people to eat, they started growing sorghum. Now, is sorghum good to eat? Anybody even know what sorghum is? You know what you use sorghum for? Well, sorghum is great for feeding cattle. So they were turning all of these productive farmlands into sorghum crops, growing sorghum, sending it up here as cattle food to feed cattle on these huge ranches in America so that you could have more Big Macs. See? And so, again, what we're finding here is that this problem of inequality of food production, rather than trying to feed the hungry of the world, too much of the world's energy is being spent trying to grow cash crops and transporting food substances away from the hungry to those who have got the money to be able to pay for it. And this has presented a major moral dilemma for many of the third world and developing nations. So the question comes, what is the most tenable solution to all of this? Well, we can seek to improve food production, obviously, and food distribution. And one of the questions that is raised then is, does this involve then the technological transfer of agricultural systems from here to third world countries? Should we be sending them all these tractors and professional equipment and fertilizers and everything else that we have that has made food so abundant in this country? And one of the things that we've discovered is that technological transfer of our sophisticated forms of agriculture is not the best idea in the world. Because as we transfer our technology to them, what we discover is that in order to sustain that technological transfer is that they've got to have a greater cash flow in order to be able to pay for the tractors, in order to be able to pay for the fertilizers, in order to be able to pay for the gasoline, in order to be able to pay for the repairs. And so what happens is, if you send all this technology down there, then they have to grow cash crops to pay for it, and it doesn't solve the food problem at all. What we need to do is have some kind of an emphasis on what the development people are now calling resource management, in which the growing of food crops for the people is made a priority, and even if they are growing less efficiently, if they are growing their own foods and are stabilizing their own need, then that is far better than trying to grow food that will be taken out of the region and somehow or another moved to another group of people at the expense of the primary source. Now, into all of this comes a whole lot of other conflicting materials, because it's not simply a matter of appropriate technology and appropriate agricultural methods for the tropics, the appropriate use of strategies for marketing and distribution. There really has to come about a grassroots revolution, if you will, in the motivation by which people want to grow crops. And a number of very interesting things are happening around the globe. One of them taking place in China right now, in which there is, in China, a movement away from the commune system in which you grow for the state, in which they allow a certain amount of privatization to take place. So if your commune grows has a certain plot of land and you grow crops for the state, and once you've met your quota for the state, then anything over and above that you can then market privately. And the end result has been that where China before was not able to produce even enough food to feed its own population, is now producing so much food that they are not only feeding their own population, they have food now that is capable of being exported, because they've been given a whole new motivation. See, it's a combination of Marxism, socialism, and capitalism. These are the kinds of innovations that need to be taking place all around the globe. And I am convinced, as are others, that the food shortage could be dramatically reversed, and there could be a food surplus taking place if appropriate resource management was taking place, if appropriate motivations were set up, and if the changes took place in the control of the international market in foodstuffs was dramatically altered. Which brings us now to what I would like to think as a conclusion now to our discussions regarding these issues. How do we as Christians relate to all of these global issues? How do we relate, for instance, to the whole question of people being poor and hungry in the midst of our affluence? And there have been a number of books that have been written on this, and you can read them, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, What Do You Say to the Hungry, and other books that have been written. But I would like to suggest 3 simple thoughts for us. It seems to me that in the face of world hunger and world need, that a prolific lifestyle is no longer acceptable for people who genuinely desire to serve the Lord Jesus Christ and to live for Him. It seems to me that if we embrace, you know what I mean by a prolific lifestyle? A lifestyle that is the lifestyle of the rich and the famous, see? A lifestyle in which we rejoice in our wealth, and we go for all of the expenses, the self-indulgence that's associated with wealth. It seems to me that we ought to be able to embrace a modest lifestyle. Do we have to have 6 of everything? Do we have to have televisions in every room? Do we have to have telephones in every corner of every room? Do we have to have the latest gadgetry? Do we have to have the latest styles? Isn't it all right once in a while to wear last year's fashions? You know, there's a whole mentality that goes with this rich and famous lifestyle. And I must admit, being someone who's not a clothes horse and you know, wear my clothes far too long and only buy new clothes when my wife says, "Is this a rag or is this your shirt?" that I begin to realize that maybe it's time to buy a new shirt. But it seems to me that we ought to live with a more modest lifestyle if we are to be truly followers of Jesus Christ. It also seems to me that a wasteful lifestyle is no longer acceptable. Do you know what it would take for the rest of the world to live at the same level of affluence that you and I live at? Do you know what it would require? It would require a world whose resources are about 100 times greater than they currently are. If the whole world tried to live at the lifestyle at which we are now living, the resources of our world would be exhausted in a few short years. The whole world simply cannot live as we are now living, in the manner in which we are now living it. And that ought to tell us something. Either we've got to find a new way to live, or we've got to start what has been often described as a lifeboat mentality. Since only a few of us can live well, the rest of you just go ahead and sink. And we will live our rich, wasteful lifestyle, sort of like survivors off of the Titanic, you know? While there are far more people that could have been taken on board those lifeboats, they were so afraid that they would sink that they sailed off half full, see, and let the rest drown. Is that an acceptable option? And I would suggest to you that I don't think so. So, and wasteful. I mean, we throw away more stuff, see, and it's just simply not an acceptable option any longer. And the exclusive lifestyle that we have tried to build for ourselves, that says we've earned it, we've worked for it, we deserve it, and the rest of the world does not. And it seems to me that this is no longer acceptable. We live in a world in which more and more we are becoming globally associated with the rest of the peoples. And somehow or another, we have got to take into consideration their well-being. And so I come to the conclusion that a responsible Christian witness before the world will incorporate a compassionate concern to address the physical needs of people as well as their spiritual needs, and that we must begin this by adapting a lifestyle that demonstrates our concern. It is no longer appropriate for us to say, go and be well fed without ever giving them anything. Go and be warm without ever clothing them, while at the same time wrapping ourselves in our own affluence. And the rest of the world, I think, is going to hold us accountable as more and more they become aware of what is available in this world, and as more and more they become aware that we are hogging the world's resources to our own affluence. So, as Christians, we need to be thinking about our own testimony that is borne out in the manner in which we live and how we will carry that out. What does that mean practically? Well, it means that you maybe will want to start cutting down some of those giant-sized portions of meat that you are eating, and it may mean doing without some of the additional clothes that you would like to have, and it may mean that you might keep your car an extra year instead of trading it in for a brand new car. And it may mean that you are going to use some of your additional resources that you save to help in the worldwide concern for bringing the gospel and a solid Christian testimony to the rest of the world. Alrighty? And with that, we come to an end.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.